Hey everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. Thank you as always for the support. If you want to support all of this work, please go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. There's a lot of videos there, some of which are available for free, some of which require that subscription. So please consider that. I would just quickly tell you before I get started that what I'm going to try to do here with the first story that I want to cover is try to summarize a much more lengthy analysis that I did over in a video over on the Patreon page. I did like 30 plus minutes going into the details on the Russian military side. And I don't have that kind of time this time. So if you want the full scope of what I was talking about, go over to the Patreon. But for now, let's just talk quickly about Russian military losses. And I'm not talking about lives, and I'm not talking about war crimes, and I'm not talking about any of these other things. I'm talking purely about military equipment, materiel, and what this tells us about the nature of the war and about the short-term, medium-term, and long-term implications of everything that's happening. And again, as I just noted, I am giving a much higher level view of this. If you want to get all of the details, you got to go check out the other video. So just looking at open source evidence, a lot of this analysis comes from open source records, information, photographs, but also official statistics. And so it has to all get put together to get some kind of a larger picture. And I am indebted to the analysis of a Russian military analyst by the name of Pavel Luzin, writing in a new outlet called Riddle, which I was unfamiliar with until a couple of days ago. But this is an excellent piece that deserves a little bit of attention. I will link to it in the video notes here. But Pavel Luzin does some pretty good research, and he comes up with a number of very interesting points that we need to discuss. First of all, we're going to break down the losses into three categories: AFVs, or armored fighting vehicles, mostly tanks and armored carriers. The second being aviation, aircraft, jets, fighter jets, bombers, attack helicopters, and the like. And the third is the missiles that they've been using. So we're going to break down these three categories and talk through what it actually means. So according to just the open source available information, the Russians have lost about a little over 2,000 tanks and armored fighting vehicles, several dozen aircraft and helicopters, and over 2,500 cruise and tactical ballistic missiles have already been used in this war. Let's talk about scale and what that actually means in context. This basically means that it's going to require massive increases in spending by the Russian government in military spending just to replace what has been lost. Not even talking about building up their stockpiles or anything like that, but just to replace what has been lost. So, talking about the economics of this, Russia spent 1.6 trillion rubles on military spending in 4 months, January through April of this year. Now, they spent the same amount January through June of last year. So in two less months, they spent the same amount. The pace is unsustainable, at least looks like it from the outside. We'll talk about whether or not that's true. So at 500 billion rubles per month, which is the current pace, they're going to need 5 trillion rubles to be spent on defense. Now, 5 trillion rubles would amount to roughly 20%, or 1/5 of the entire federal budget for the Russian Federation. Now, as a comparison, the United States, the entire absolutely despicable and disgusting bloated Pentagon budget that we've all been protesting against for our entire lives, that stands at $778 billion out of a total of $6 trillion in the US budget, which amounts to 13%. In other words, the Russian government is going to have to, proportionally speaking, way outspend the United States in terms of defense just to keep pace with its losses. I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of scale here. Obviously, I would just reiterate the point that Russia and the United States are not comparable, apples to apples comparison. But in terms of spending ratios, this is where I think we understand the significance of this. So regardless of the spending, Russia is not going to be able to replace the equipment that it lost, simply because they will never be able to keep up with the demand. Just because they need 10 new tanks to replace the 10 that were blown up doesn't mean that Uralvagonzavod, the state manufacturer, or any of the other companies are going to actually be able to manufacture and deliver those 10, given all of the other things that are going on, including sanctions, supply chain issues, labor shortages, and a host of other factors. So they are in a very difficult position from a material perspective. Now, let's just talk quickly about numbers. And again, I'm skipping over a lot, so please forgive me if you think that there's a gap in some of this. You have to read through the article and go and check out my video on this. So Russia, as far as let's take the first category, AFVs, armored fighting vehicles, tanks, etc. The Russians inherited a lot of it, probably most of it from the Soviet Union. They have developed some of their own, including the T-90 and the BMD-4 amphibious infantry vehicles. But for the most part, the replacements, that is to say, those that come onto the battlefield to replace those that have been destroyed or put out of service, most of those replacements come from refurbishing Soviet models. And by refurbishing, we basically mean putting in a new engine, putting in thermal sighting systems, putting in advanced communication systems onto these old tanks. That's the majority of what they do. Now, they had at the beginning of the war, so we're talking February of this year, they had roughly 2,000 out of 3,000 AFVs ready for combat. So 2/3 of their AFVs. Now, another way of saying that is 1/3 of all of their tanks and armored vehicles were not in service, not available for service. 16,000 total AFVs. So a proportion of those upgraded and produced in the 2010s is roughly 25%. That was a mangled sentence. Let me rephrase that. 25% of their total AFV force was delivered in the 2010s. Now, translate that. 75% then of Russian tanks are old and outdated, having come around at some time before 2010. And again, based on the numbers that we've been looking at, most likely holdovers from the Soviet stockpile. So this is part of the reason why we saw so many Russian tanks bombed out, destroyed, being pulled by tractors, etc. They're old. This is old equipment, and it can't really function, at least not at a high level, in a modern battlefield. So the war, and we should also point out, war greatly reduces the lifespan of these vehicles. So some of the more advanced ones, like the T-72, those are estimated to not exceed 1,000 hours before they require an overhaul. Now, what we mean by overhaul, that means not fixing it on the battlefield, in the battle space. It means removing it completely from the theater of conflict, sending it back to Russia to a factory or some other facility where it can be properly overhauled. Okay, that is not something that you can just do on the battlefield. Okay, so this is again illustrates some of the logistical complications that make Russia's war-making capability far less than what a lot of fearmongers like to say it is. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is that most of Russia's tanks are going to require an overhaul by the end of this year. Most of them will. Considering the number of hours of service time, considering the conditions that they've been operating in, most of them are going to be pulled off of the battlefield and sent to factories and facilities to be overhauled. What does that mean for the war? So the other aspect of this that has to be pointed out is that the Russians don't have all of the labor that they would need in order to carry this out. So what that means then is companies like I mentioned, Ural Vagon Zavod, which is the manufacturer, the primary manufacturer of these vehicles, they are running on emergency production schedule, triple shifts, round the clock, etc. I think we all hopefully have enough understanding of work to know what that means. That means that the quantity of output is maintained while the quality goes significantly down. The more and harder and longer you work people, especially emergency workers who might not even be expert technicians, might not even have engineering backgrounds, etc., the more you work them, the more you degrade the quality of the final product. This is not a Russian problem. That is a human problem. So the this also leads to cost push inflation. Uralvagonzavod was in bankruptcy or facing bankruptcy in 2016. It was essentially nationalized, and now you see all of the costs, as usual, skyrocketing. And to justify the investment, they're going to have to continue plowing more and more money into this. After 4 months of war, 4 months, it will take roughly 4 years, according to reasonable estimates, 4 years to replace, or rather to restore Russia's AFVs to where they were when this war began. That's if the war ended today, but it ain't ending today, is it? It's going to continue. And if the war continues, estimates range from 7 to 10 years just to get back to where they were when the war started. Let's move on and talk about aviation. At the start of the war, the Russians had 900 to 1,000 fighters, fighter bombers, bombers, and attack aircraft. Of those, 350 were delivered in the 2010s, in that decade. So you're talking about somewhere between 35 and 40% of their total fleet of aircraft were relatively recently delivered. Now, that's obviously a better proportion than we have with the tanks, but it still ultimately shows the limitations of what Russia can actually do in terms of what it can produce. At its peak, Russia produced 35 new aircraft per year. 35 new aircraft per year. Do the math. That tells you you're looking at about 10 years. 10 years to get up to that 350 that were delivered. So again, you're talking about time frames that go far beyond what our normal news cycle wants you to think about. 400 attack helicopters at the start of the war, 300 of which were produced in the 2010s. So 75% of them are new. That's probably the best ratio that the Russians have in terms of new equipment versus old equipment. And that makes sense. The attack helicopters that we see today are a newer technology than some of those fighter jets, etc. So you've had the Russians had about 200 upgraded and delivered per year. They planned for 2021 through 2027 to deliver 150. Impossible. Absolutely impossible for the Russians to do that now. How are they going to do that when they can't secure the parts, when they don't have the comm systems, when they don't have the advanced machinery and equipment in order to be able to produce these aircraft? So again, it seems impossible. So that raises the question. The Russians have one of two options. Either they revise the numbers down, meaning the number of new aircraft they plan to produce and deliver to the military. Either they revise the number from 150 over the 6 years way down, or they maintain that number and lower the quality of what they produce. There's no way to maintain a high level of quality and to produce that level of output given all of the constraints. And based on at least the evidence that seems to be emerging now, the Russians have not opted to reduce the number. So they're maintaining their goal, maintaining the number, which I think tells you that the quality is going to suffer. And this could be seen in any number of ways. The quality of the manufacturing of the aircraft and others. It could be in terms of the production, the systems of production, etc. All right, I got to move on. Missiles. I want to talk about missiles. It's impossible to estimate the number that the Russians had at the beginning of the war, but there is a consensus in Moscow among experts, maybe who won't speak publicly on it, that there is a major shortage now. The Russians have fired 2,500 missiles. Think about the scale of that. Think about the destruction that 2,500 tactical ballistic and cruise missiles can do in a country like Ukraine. 2,500 such missiles. Okay, so let's just for a moment regain our humanity and think about what it means to hide in a basement when that number of missiles is falling on your country. So again, this is not to say that that there's nothing to be said about the Ukrainian side, but we have to maintain our humanity as we think about these things. These are not just numbers, and this is not just equipment. These are human beings on the receiving end of all of this. Okay, so anyway, 2,500 of them have been used. Now let's just quickly talk about the kinds of missiles they have. Most of them are old Soviet models, including the KH-55 and the KH-22, both of which are cruise missiles, neither of which are manufactured anymore. So once they're fired, they're fired. Same for the Tochka U, which is also a Soviet relic. That's a tactical ballistic missile, not a cruise missile. And this is interesting to note. if you remember Kramatorsk a couple of months back, in the earlier part of this war, Kramatorsk, the train station, was struck by a missile. Now, there was a lot of competing information online about that, and most of the Western analysts had said that this was clearly fired by the Russians. The Ukrainians said they had all of the evidence they needed to say it was fired by the Russians. And of course, the Russians said, no, 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 no. The Ukrainians are the ones who fired that to create a provocation. This is the same old tired false flag argument they use every time, right? And they did it again in Kramatorsk. But here's the problem: the Russian propagandists said Russia doesn't use Tochka. Ukrainians use Tochka. Hey, guess what? Turns out we have all of the evidence now. The Russians are using Tochka missiles, and they're using them actually at a pretty high clip. So that again should remind us about the propaganda war that is part of this conflict. You're always going to hear those who have a pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin slant saying that the Russians couldn't have done this, that it had to be a provocation by the Ukrainians because the Russians don't use whatever it is, X. In this case, the Tochka missile, guess what they do? Uh, Also, the Russians have developed some of their own, more modern weapons long after the Soviet period. The Iskander M missile is a Russian model from fairly recent years. Similarly, the Caliber, which is a ship-launched cruise missile, which is another one of those, and also the P-800 Onyx supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, which the Russians have developed. Okay, so but they are using the Tochka. They're using a lot of this old equipment. And the bottom line here, and I know I'm running out of time because I have a couple of other stories to cover here, but the bottom line is that the productivity is going to become a major problem for engine manufacturing, especially. Not only are they not able to get the parts due to the sanctions, they also, as I mentioned already, they have a labor problem. According to the most recent analysis, Russia's United Engine Corporation is between 6 and 11 times lower in productivity than its peers in the United States, specifically General Electric and Williams International, the two primary engine manufacturers, those that manufacture the engines that go on to these missiles. How can the Russians continue to keep pace with their use in terms of their stockpile if their production is 10 times less productive than the United States is? Okay, so again, an unsustainable development model when it comes to their military industrial complex. So this idea that Russia is this all powerful entity that can just impose its will, it's totally bogus. The Russians are barely hanging on in terms of their production capacities. All right, so in total, the Russians can manufacture a maximum of 225 cruise and tactical missiles per year. That is a maximum if all things are going well and they can get the parts, etc. So, under the best of conditions, it would take them roughly 10 years to make up the losses of just the missiles that they've already fired. Okay, so again, we're talking about scale so that we can put it in context and understand what the Russians actually are capable of versus what they're not really capable of. And that brings me to another story that deserves some attention, not because I agree with all of it, I don't, but because it makes a couple of key points. This was an op-ed in NBC News. This comes from a Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. I don't know anything about him other than what I could read in the tone of what he wrote. He seems to have something of a, I guess, what we could call a sort of a right-wing isolationist sort of view within the U.S. military, retired U.S. military. Not uncommon, very much a thread that exists within the sort of Trumpist camp. I wouldn't necessarily call it an isolationist worldview. I don't think that's what it is. In fact, I think that is a bad analysis. But there are some that do espouse that do align on the right. Anyway, that's just my sense of it. I can't really speak to this Lieutenant Colonel Davis, but reading his article, I thought he made some pretty interesting points. Number one, he's talking about, well, let me back up. The article is about NATO bringing Finland and Sweden into the alliance and what a bad idea that is. I have to agree with Lieutenant Colonel Davis on that one. He notes that the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO increases, not decreases, increases the risk of war. Obviously, for 100 different reasons, but the most obvious is that it adds two new triggers for Article 5. Remember, Article 5 is the mutual defense article. It is a founding principle of NATO. It says that an attack on any NATO country is an attack on the entire alliance, and more importantly, the alliance is legally obligated to militarily defend any of its members. So now you add two new members, you increase the chances of a full scale NATO Russia war. That's not to say that Russia's any more likely to invade Sweden or Finland today than it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago or 50 years ago necessarily, but it does mean that the risk of escalation is there. So this from the Sweden, and this is interesting to think about. If you're Swedish or Finnish, there's two ways of interpreting what Russia has done. Either Russia's invasion of Ukraine tells you have to join NATO in order to protect yourself, or it says Russia's invasion of Ukraine tells me, thank God, I'm neutral and I need to maintain my neutrality so that I am never a target of the Russians, nor am I duty bound by the United States to get involved in some war. That was always the logic of neutrality. It always was logical, and it remains logical today. Unfortunately, many have thrown logic out the window, in my view. Again, this is not to say that Russia shouldn't be opposed. It is to raise the question of what Sweden and Finland's entry into NATO actually does for all of Europe and for the entire world. I'm going to talk about that one in a second. Russia saw Finland and Sweden as really no threat. I mean, again, NATO has always been the threat that Russia was afraid of. That's why Russia kept threatening over Georgia, kept threatening over Ukraine, and in fact waged a war on Georgia in 2008 over the NATO issue, or at least ostensibly over the NATO issue, and again in 2014 with Ukraine, and began the war in Ukraine over, well, at least ostensibly over the NATO issue. Although, if you go back to all my other videos, I talk about why that's not really what this is about. It's only a small part of what this is about. So let's think about that another way. Georgia and Ukraine clearly did have very real and unmistakably correct interpretation of Russia as a very real threat. Both of those countries have been invaded by Russia. Sweden and Finland not. They've never been, well, I don't want to say never. There's the Winter War, but that's going back to pre-World War II. Since World War II, Sweden and Finland have never been threatened by Russia or the Soviet Union. In fact, Finland was a close, I don't want to say ally, they weren't an ally, but they were friendly with the Soviets for all of those decades. So with neutrality gone, Sweden and Finland now become targets in any conflict, obviously. So now Sweden and Finland can join Ukraine and Georgia as countries that have real fear of being attacked by Russia, almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. So let's think through what actually happens here. Sweden and Finland enter into NATO. A conflict breaks out between Russia and NATO. Unfortunately, I can't say that that's not a possibility. It is a possibility given everything that's happening now. So Russia is now in a war with NATO. Finland and Sweden belong to NATO. If NATO is in a war, Finland, especially, is going to be on the front line of this conflict, given the fact that they share an 800-mile border with the Russians. So, if you're the Russians and you're looking at the map and you're seeing a scenario where you're in a war with NATO, you're bombing Finland almost immediately, because you know that the airfields in Sweden and Finland are going to become the launching points for any attack on your country. So, by virtue of entering into NATO, they make themselves prime targets. Now, I understand that it might be sort of a reverse logic for some people, but it's true. The world doesn't neatly, doesn't work in neat little tidy ways. You can't just join the alliance and then somehow feel protected. In fact, you're more vulnerable, and that's, I guess the word really is, that's sort of the paradoxical nature of a military alliance like NATO, given these conditions. The other issue that needs to be brought up, and I appreciate Lieutenant Colonel Davis for bringing this up. The expansion of NATO to include Sweden and Finland is simply not necessary. given what we've seen in this war. Russia has exposed itself to be shockingly weak in terms of its conventional military forces. Russia invaded Ukraine and can't even control Donbass after 4 months. How in the world does anybody really expect the Russians to honestly confront NATO and invade a NATO country? Do you really think if the Russians invade and can't conquer Ukraine, that somehow they're going to invade Finland or Poland or Romania? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. The Russians simply have shown that they don't have the capabilities that they thump their chests about every single day. The Russians posture as a military superpower and then get exposed in Ukraine. Is that something that we need to be risking nuclear war and the destruction of all of Europe over? I don't think so. Now, again, this isn't to say that we should be saying that the Ukrainians should throw in the towel. Of course not. Ukraine was invaded. Ukraine has every right to fight off its invader, to fight off the aggressor. But in the larger picture, which doesn't end at Ukraine's borders, and I'm going to talk about that on another story in just a second, in the larger sense, it is imperative that we understand what Russia really is and what Russia isn't. Russia is a nuclear power. It is not a military superpower. And we are seeing that playing out in Ukraine. And so that brings us to the final point that Davis makes, and it's by far the most important point he makes in the article. He notes that he was a participant in a 2019 US government exercise which simulated a nuclear exchange over a war in Ukraine. So it simulated exactly the scenario that we all fear. And based on their simulations, a nuclear exchange, regardless of who fired it first, regardless of whether a NATO country or Russia initiated the first nuclear attack, this simulation showed a minimum of 1 billion dead from this exchange. Okay, let me say that again. 1 billion dead. Those are the stakes when we're talking about Ukraine and war in Europe and NATO. Okay, Russia uses NATO as a pretext for everything. This we know. But that doesn't mean that NATO isn't an extraordinary threat to the entire planet. It is. Both of those things happening, both of those things are true. Okay? Keep that in mind because the final story I want to talk about comes out of Belarus. Now, as we know, Belarus has been a very much sort of a party to this war, even though technically their forces are not in Ukraine. They have more or less become a party to the war, one of Russia's staging grounds, etc. I think we all understand Belarus's role here. So the deputy chief of the general staff of Belarus's armed forces, a guy named Ruslan Kosygin, made some pretty interesting statements. And specifically, he was talking about Poland and how Belarus will be, in his words, will be forced to attack Poland if Poland continues with its aggressive posture vis-a-vis Ukraine. So let's just talk about this. He points to a couple of what he calls provocations. One is military exercises being conducted, in Poland and elsewhere, and the other is individual Polish politicians who have been threatening to take back what they call, ancestral Polish lands. Now, the ancestral Polish lands are those parts of both Western Ukraine and Western Belarus that, going back a couple of centuries, were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire that are what they call historically Polish. That's a bit of a debatable term. I wouldn't use that, and I don't think that the world works that way, but that's beside the point. There are historical ties of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus to Poland. There are obviously right-wing politicians in Poland that, use the kind of revanchist terminology and revanchist rhetoric that we see in Russia all the time with regard to Ukraine. So anyway, between the military exercises and the individual politicians, there seems to be, at least from Belarus's perspective, saber rattling coming from Poland. So what does he say? He says, in any provocation scenario, Belarus will first attack Polish infrastructure. Okay, he talks about Polish infrastructure. Think about what he's actually saying here. He's not saying, oh, we're just going to attack Poland. He's saying we will initiate a destructive war that attacks their energy grid, their transportation infrastructure, maybe the embassy, heads of government, etc. There's a whole raft of possibilities. Now, why do I note this? Not because one military guy in Belarus saying something means that we're on the brink of Belarus attacking Poland. No. I bring this up because it is important to keep fresh in our minds what a realistic scenario for expanding this war would look like. Just because Russia invaded Ukraine and the United States and Western Europe is supporting Ukraine, it doesn't mean that there aren't other parties that are involved in this conflict in various ways that, with through their own agency and maybe even through their own political needs, might expand the war under their own initiative, maybe under the auspices of one of the larger players. Of course, Lukashenko in Belarus is now more or less a proxy of Putin. It wasn't always that way in recent years. They had conflict with each other, but in since the uprising in Belarus, Lukashenko's clamped down and moved very close to Daddy Putin. Now we have a scenario where Belarus and Poland are antagonizing each other. And what if a little war breaks out between Belarus and Poland in the midst of this other war that's already happening? These things have happened historically many times. We've had wars expand in this way. In fact, world wars expand in this way. So I think we should be sober in thinking through the implications of everything that is happening, including statements coming from both sides. I'm over 30 minutes, so I'm going to have to leave it there. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. That's where you can find all of the videos, in-depth analysis, plus some of the other stuff that I do, including writing and poetry stuff and other things. Anyway, thanks for the support. Talk to you all next time.